Today we are cooking the sourdough bread recipe that I promised you guys on Facebook. This is a recipe that I got from the Laurel's Kitchen cookbook. It actually started out as a French bread recipe, but then when I found out that you can have sourdough and an unlimited supply of yeast, I was in. And it turns out that sourdough bread is got a fantastic taste. It actually beats French bread in my opinion, hands down. And it started with this right here. This is my sourdough starter. I started it with from scratch, with water and with flour. And it's a process, it's a lactic acid bacteria. They call it a lab chemical reaction. And it produces carbon dioxide and ethanol, and this one right here has not been fed, and you can actually see the liquid separated. That the liquid there is ethanol, and it is alcohol. And in the Civil War they called that hooch, and they used to drink it. But it is not a problem. That just means I need to feed it. And some people will pour that ethanol off. Some people just swish it right back in with a new load of flour when they feed it. Every time I feed my starter, it's half water and half flour. I'll mix that in, and really half and half can change based on your flour. Some flours absorb more water than other flours, and that's actually really important with sourdough bread. The recipe will actually change with the type of flour that you use. So my recipe is kind of it's very loose in that depending on your flour, you might need to actually alter it in textures, and the feel of it is something that you just get used to, and you will have to experiment with this with yourself. Even people that have been doing this for years and years and years still have, especially if they're switching things around, will have a different result almost every time.
Should you tell them how to catch the yeast? Maybe some people don't have starter. Where would you get starter?
I'm not going to worry about
that. Okay.
Okay.
Where would you get starter?
All right. You're asking. Okay, starter.
For the audience.
Okay.
I'm just thinking some people might.
Right. You can buy starters online. You can catch your own, and that's what I did.
So maybe someone could message you if they.
Oh yes,
would like to catch
I am working right now on a starter that is dried, and I could actually send it to you
In the mail.
In the mail. So that is what it is. Sometimes you can inherit it from someone else, because starters are like a living organism. You have to feed them and they will continually grow, whether you like that or not. And there's only a few ways where you can store a starter, and they're really hard to kill. And I've heard people say that they've killed their starter, but that's actually probably not the case. If a layer of mold grows on top of your starter, you can actually just take that mold off, and all the yeast is still there. Just feed it, and it'll come back. Put it in a clean jar.
So someone could message you after this video if they would like some of our starter.
That is correct.
Okay.
And we could maybe schedule a pickup, or we could even mail it to you. Obviously, probably some money transaction will have to happen there. That'll be some expense.
For the mail.
Yeah.
Right. But they could message you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
this video is assuming you have a starter.
This video is assuming you have a starter.
Okay.
Now, I already have my ingredients in here. 2 cups of all-purpose unbleached flour. Mm-hmm. I have a half a teaspoon of salt that I put into the flour, and I mix it into the flour, all the dry ingredients at one time. Then I add the starter, and I add about a half a cup of water.
How much starter do you put in?
I guess I didn't say that, did I? 1.5 cups of starter. And then you just want to bring all that together. And I use a spatula at first. Some people like really getting themselves into this. And so you'll just mix this up until it starts coming together. Okay, now we've got our bread is mostly, it'll bind together, and you can actually see that it kind of pulls apart pretty easy. So we've just started kneading it. And if you've got a mixer with a bread hook, you just let that turkey go for 10 minutes and you'll have a pretty decent bread. And there's a couple I like. You work it. As this starts to come together, you'll feel the bottom and the top surface of the bread kind of slide past one another as you're kneading that. And I'm turning, and you're working those gluten fibers together. And you see how sticky this is? It'll actually get less sticky as the gluten starts to develop. And this just takes just about 10 minutes, and I really like playing with it. There's a video at the end of the credits of Kung Fu Panda where they were actually making noodles, and they used the fibers of the bread or of the dough to make noodles, and they use the same process, and it's amazing how elastic the fibers can get for sourdough. It's pretty amazing.
So what if people want to use other types of flours instead of unbleached all-purpose?
You can use any kind of flour that you want. My understanding is the classic sourdough bread flour is actually spelt flour. That's actually the flour that I used for my original starter, and it just made one of the most, I love this starter that I have. I've never had sourdough bread like the bread that I'm able to make myself. I've had sourdough bread at fine restaurants, and it just doesn't compare to the taste of this particular starter. Every starter actually has its own strain. It has its own DNA, so to speak, and every one of them is going to be different. Sourdough in America actually started in San Francisco. There was a family that discovered, they had been in the bread business, if I'm understanding it correctly, in France, and when they came over and discovered the culture that they were able to develop right there in San Francisco, it actually made just this fantastic bread that became the rage with all of the prospectors, because that was at the same time as the gold rush on the West Coast, and the men would have their own starter that they would use out in the field because commercial yeast didn't exist, and brewer's yeast, or yeast that they would have gotten from a brewer, would have been difficult to get to. And so they would actually take this starter with them, and they would keep the starter under their pillow or roll up in their bedroll, even on their person to keep it from freezing. And they would use it for flapjacks and for bread. So I thought that was really interesting. And because of the way the fermentation process is, it's similar to vinegar, and it gets this kind of I don't want to say pungent because that doesn't have a very nice sound to it, but I guess you could say a vinegary. It's kind of a in between vinegar and alcohol kind of a smell that is just it's nice. It's a pleasant smell, and that's one reason that you've got it right.
And so how often are you feeding a starter that you have?
Well, it really depends. That's actually a good point to get to, because you want to have a pretty active, and you can see the difference between these two starters here. This guy, one is the liquid is separated. He's in need of food. This guy, I fed him just an hour ago, and lots of bubbles. You see the bubbles around the top there? That's a fed starter. You'll want to feed your starter about an hour, 2 hours before you make your bread. And again, it's all by feel too. That actually, if the temperature in your house is warmer, all the reactions are going to happen faster.
So you're storing starter on your counter?
Yes. When I'm not using it as often, I'll store it in the fridge, and it can last a week, 2 weeks even, in the fridge, and then after about 2 weeks, you'll get that separation, and it's time to start feeding it.
And then you'd feed it about an hour before you would use it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and for a starter that size, see, I've got about 2 cups worth of starter in there. I could double that. You don't want to exceed the amount of starter to food. So your starter to food ratio would have to be 1-to-1.
Okay. And also say you could use this sourdough for pancakes, pizza crust, for about anything you'd use normal dough for, correct?
Yes. The pancakes that this sourdough starter makes is amazing.
Biscuits.
It makes biscuits. We've made pizza with it. And one of our favorites in the house is sourdough puff bread.
Yes.
We'll have to do a video about that.
Yeah.
The puff bread. It's
yummy.
It's insane. It's so good. And so you can really, so now look at the difference as that has, see how the texture has changed, and just working it, folding it, this rolling action. I can feel the top and the bottom of the dough rolling together, rolling past the top and the bottom surface. And then the girls love this. You can stretch it, and this is something I do because it's fun. And you roll it up, just keep rolling it, and we're getting there. And so the question is, so how do you know that it's been kneaded enough? Well, I mean, when you're getting that elastic going to it, to where it is really getting stretchy and it's not ripping and tearing anymore, this is a good indication where they call it a window pane, where you can stretch it and you can see through it. And so there's no tearing there, and that's how you know that your dough is ready.
So I think you calculated per loaf what this costs. Because you're not using yeast, you're not using eggs, and it was very cheap to make.
Oh, it's super cheap to make. Yeah. And it's fun. I mean, I make this bread in the house. I mean, and what I'll do too is, like how you time it, is this bread will work with you. So like I could take this, it's ready. I could take it, put it in a bowl, cover it with something to where there's not as much air getting in or out. I can stick it in the fridge and it'll be happy all night long. And I don't have to deal with it now. I could deal with it later.
Right.
And then when it comes out of the fridge, I would just turn it out of the bowl.
Right, knead it again.
And I could just stick it right back in the fridge. I could do that for days.
Right.
And all it's going to happen is it's going to get more sour, and it'll have a more sour flavor. And for most people, that's what they're after anyway, so that's great. But I will knead my dough in the evening before bed, I will set it out on the counter at temperatures around 68 degrees, which is about what our house is in the winter. And I'll just let it sit out all night. So it ends up being about anywhere between 10 and 12 hours. And then in the morning, I'll come down and this will fill this entire bowl. It'll fill the entire bowl. All right, so now this bread has risen, and what we're going to do now is we're going to shape it. Shaping is basically you're trying to achieve tension on the top surface of the loaf. And now you can shape in a bunch of different ways. You can round loaves are fun. You can stretch out the loaf to other shapes. You've seen them, I imagine, where they're braided or whatever. I mean, you can do whatever you want with it. So you can shape it however you want, and this is the shape that you're going to give it before its final rise, before you put it into the oven. So we're going to do a round, and so you can see just bringing that bottom together, and you want to make sure that, see how that's not all coming together there. We want that to come together, and so actually I'll probably push it in a bit, and then by, let's see if I get a better precision here. You're scooping it and bringing it in, turning it, and you're just trying to put tension on that surface there. See how the bottom looks? Yeah. So let's poke that together actually, because it's not coming together. Alright, so we want that bottom to close. And so once we have a round shape and we've got a nice tension on the surface there, then it's ready to go into a pan. Now, I use a larger bowl to prep my cloth, and so you'll see in videos, in other YouTube videos, where they'll use these sourdough pans. They're special, they work great. I've never done that. I've always just, whatever I have is what I use. I tend not to buy special stuff for bread. And so just a cloth. And again, I'm using an oversized cloth, and then I'll add a little bit of flour.
This is for the final rise?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is our shape that we're going to have, and so I'm sprinkling flour over the surface of this just a little bit to keep it from sticking to the cloth while it's rising for its final time.
And how long does it rise at the end?
You actually don't know. It actually totally depends on how hydrated your dough is and the room temperature. So, taking our loaf, I flip it over, set it down in here, and now the reason I use a larger bowl is so that there's flour that goes out further, so that it goes up the sides. So this is the shape of the bowl that I want for my final rising. This one's already transferred. So what I'll do is I'll pull it out of my larger bowl and I'll put it into another bowl that has more of the, I wanted a high shape. I want a high shape.
High sides more.
Yes, exactly. Because this guy, he's going to rise all the way, no, he was at the bottom down here. He's going to rise all the way up to...
So you're saying that strawberry bowl is not a good final rise bowl?
Right, because it would spread out too much,
yeah.
And then I'd have a much flatter loaf.
Right, okay.
And so since I want a high loaf...
That's the bowl you would
This is the bowl I'd want to actually rise in. The only reason I'm using the larger bowl here is because it spreads the flour out further, and then when I put it in there, that flour comes around the sides.
For your first rise, can you use that bowl, or you just want to use a higher bowl for all your rising?
Oh no, this is for just pre-bake.
Which is your final rise?
Right.
Okay.
First rise, this one...
It's totally fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't matter, because you just slap it out of the bowl and you shape it after
Okay,
that.
got it. Okay.
And then once you've let this, once this rises for about, I'll probably let this one rise for about an hour and a half. But how you know your flour has risen enough is actually the poke test. So I will. So this has already been in for a little while. It's only just starting to rise, and so I poke it, and see how my finger mark comes right back.
Yes.
It's not ready. When it is ready, you'll poke it, and it will leave. It'll come back slowly, and it'll leave a bit of an indent. That came back quickly, and it didn't leave much of an indent at all. So that's how you know it still needs more time. So this guy needs probably about another hour, and then it'll be ready for the oven. All right. Well, this is our last part. Our dough is fairly risen. It's not totally done, but it's close enough. And that's actually something that you'll notice. Even if you don't let it rise as much as it could, all that means is that when it's in the oven, it will split more, and that'll have a really interesting effect to your loaf. So let's give it the poke test again. Yep, see that came back pretty quick. So it probably could use some more time, but we're going to throw it in the oven anyway. So with the stone, you can take it right out of the stove and place the bread on it. And that is actually really convenient. Really hot, so be careful. And I'll just try to place my bread on here, multitasking here. So this is really handy. So turn out the bread, and let's position that. And see, it still wants to stick a little bit, so you have to be careful. Part of that's because my cloth is underneath. Normally I don't do this through a camera. There we go. So now our it's mostly there, and we want to put a cut in it. This is a clean utility blade. Very sharp knife comes in very handy, or something like this. Alright, and so you can see it's expanding already. There definitely was some more room for rising, but I'm running out of light. So, here we go. Put it in the oven. Oops. And if you see the cast iron pan down there, I'll put a cup of water in that pan. Here's our water. Lots of steam, that's what you want. What you're doing, oh my, steamed up the video. Okay, there we go. So yeah, you want to add that steam to the oven. Our oven is very old and leaky, so most of the steam leaks out. If you have one of the newer ovens, you can just put a pan of water at the bottom of your oven, and that will do the job. What you're doing is you are mimicking the old by adding water to your oven. You are mimicking the older stone ovens that would have been high moisture baking, and that's what gives you that golden crust. It's what makes it crispy on the outside and like heaven on the inside. And so that's kind of what you're after, and that water will do it. So you let it cook at 4 450 or 475 for about 20 minutes, and then you turn it down to 350, and you cook it for about another 25 minutes at 350, and then your dough is, or your now finished loaf will be ready to come out of the oven. Alright, so now our bread is done. It's been in for its full time. And you can see that, good heavens. That looks pretty good. Yes, sir. Alright. Look at that. So the next part is the cooling of your bread. It's a pretty important part to have a good crust. So once you have your bread out of the oven, then you want to cover your bread, and that prevents it from cooling too rapidly, and it really helps develop that that outer crust that you want to have. And you just give that 10 minutes, uncover it, and then you let it cool the rest of the way.